And welcome to the Road from Emmaus podcast. I'm Ferran, and along with Kim, we seek to our listeners and watchers on a guided tour of redemptive history, showcasing the beauty, splendor, and unity of God's amazing story of cosmic redemption, restoration, and renewal. We hope that a warm conversational tone and format makes an unfamiliar topic for many and intimidating for some, more approachable, accessible, and digestible unto the growth of the body. We're going to build on where we left off last week, episode 55, the inbreaking and the kingdom, and the word became flesh, where we really talked about the centrality and importance of the incarnation, but also the background and how a lot of different movements have taken a lot of different agendas that are not aligned with how the Bible speaks on its own terms. And then ultimately, why it's important for us to understand that, how it leads to certain concepts, certain things that are present around those things today, but also really pushing us towards making sure that we're letting scripture speak for itself and rightly understanding these things. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump in. Consider how the scripture resists speaking of incarnation in the abstract categories of deity and humanity, and instead presents it as God of Israel taking up Israel's life and circumstances within himself. What do you say to that? And then why is that consideration so important for people to arrive at right conclusions here?
Well, what we're trying to do is to challenge people to think more biblically about, well, everything, but certainly here, this issue of incarnation. And, often Christian debates have centered around, did Jesus ever claim to be God? Or does the New Testament ever say he's God? Or how is he God? How is he man? But again, in kind of the abstract, in isolation. And if we're to think biblically about this thing of incarnation, and more broadly, think biblically about Jesus himself, who he was, what he did, what he was trying to accomplish, where all of this is going, then we have to look at those things through the lens of the scriptures themselves. But that doesn't mean simply finding 6 or 8 verses that we can stick together in a collage and say, oh, okay, here's some things where the Bible, has a messianic passage or whatever in the Old Testament. What we're trying to help our viewers to see is that this is a step-by-step, stone upon stone, piece upon piece sort of endeavor. If someone learns mathematics, they don't just say, oh, okay, here, let's go look at calculus. It doesn't work in that sort of way. You start as a 5-year-old learning your addition tables from 1 to 10 or whatever. 1 plus 1 is 2, 2 plus 2 is 4. But that's not the end of the story, and no 5-year-old thinks, okay, I've learned my addition tables 1 to 10. I'm done with mathematics. Now, maybe they do in some simple sort of way. But as we grow and we learn, we realize we're just building stones upon each other. And I can't do calculus if I don't know my addition tables from 1 to 10. But I'm not done with mathematics when I've learned my addition tables. And learning the scriptures ultimately with the goal of learning Christ and being conformed to him, being transformed into his likeness, which is really what the Christian life is all about, requires that we undertake this in the same sort of way. And that means that we start at the beginning and we build and we build and we build and we build. So by the time we come to the birth of Jesus, we have this whole structure that we've put in place. And we don't want to forget about that and say, oh, okay, that was interesting. That was the Old Testament. I don't care about that. Oh, here's Jesus. Now we're getting down to the Christian stuff. It doesn't work in that sort of a way. So our challenge to people is to recognize that we cannot understand the person and the work of Christ, whether this thing incarnation or whatever, unless we understand him through the lens of this long story that begins in Genesis 1 and climaxes with finally Jesus being born into the world. Whether we like it or not, this is the way God has been determined to accomplish his purposes. He didn't just shoot Jesus into the world, the minute that he created the world or the minute that Adam fell or whatever. There's a long process building the case for what this is going to be and what it's going to accomplish. And if we're going to understand what God has done and what it is that we're a part of and where this is going, then we have to understand it in the way that he wants us to understand it. And that means that we have to do the work of building this case piece by piece, stone upon stone, word upon word, and that there's just no easy way to get around that. So I say that just again because I'm sure that our previous episodes, some people were saying, wow, I have no idea what these guys are talking about. This just seems over my head. All I care about is that Jesus was fully God and he died for my sins. Well, we can't leave it there and think that we really understand what the scriptures are about. So there's a way in which God builds the case for our understanding of the person and the work of Jesus, and that includes this issue of incarnation, the Word becoming flesh. So that's kind of our goal in that way, and that's what we mean when we say that the Bible doesn't present this thing of incarnation in terms of these abstract, isolated philosophical categories of deity and humanity stuck together. And those things don't really help us to understand the person and the work of Christ. But rather, this is ultimately, if we know the story, if we know the Old Testament story that begins in Eden and the calling of Abraham and the history of Israel, then as you said, even in your question, we understand incarnation in terms of this is how the God of Israel, who promised to return and to liberate and to heal and to restore, to put all things right. This is how the God of Israel is accomplishing that work. And he's doing it by taking up Israel's own life and lot, Israel's circumstance, Israel's brokenness in himself, in order to heal Israel from within so that Israel can be the light of the nations and accomplish its Abrahamic mission. This is the fundamental way that the Bible understands incarnation. And that's why we talked about the servant songs the last time, because that's what you see. God's going to return in connection with a servant who he raises up from within Israel and whom he empowers by his spirit. This Israelite, this servant is man of the spirit. And in and through that Israelite, in and through that son, servant, disciple, and witness, Yahweh will accomplish this work that he has promised to do. That's the way the scriptures want us to start with understanding this idea of incarnation.
Building on that, how does Israel's role in God's creational purpose, the sanctuary of sacred space, and Israel's shared alienation frame Yahweh's promise to restore intimate divine human communion for Israel and ultimately for all creation?
Well, again, this takes us back to this fundamental basic question. What is God's big plan? Why did he create? What did he have in mind? Did he have anything in mind? Did he just want to show that he could create a universe or whatever? What is his purpose? Well, the scriptures tell us that God's purpose for creating was that he would, as we said last time, he would be present in his creation and fill it with his presence and administer his relationship with that creation as his dwelling place in and through human beings who are his image and likeness. That's the purpose for the creation. That's the purpose for mankind. That's the purpose for human existence. So we could put it most simply as saying, God's purpose for the creation is that it would be sacred space. Once again, sacred space refers to where and how and in what way God is actually present in and related to his creation. And so sacred space begins in the first instance in coming out of the garden. The Garden of Eden is the first instance of sacred space. The garden is his dwelling place where he's there with human beings and there to fill the earth and so take his presence and his lordship across the whole of the world. Well, after that, we now begin to have these things of sanctuaries, and God calls Abraham to himself and says, I'll be your God, and you and your descendants will be my people. I will dwell with you. He brings then those Abrahamic people out of Egypt to bring them to Canaan. He says, now Eden isn't it, but I've marked out Canaan to be sacred space. Canaan is my sanctuary. Canaan is my temple. It's the place where I abide. And I'm bringing you here to be with me. So I'm bringing you out of Egypt. Well, then they build a sanctuary. They build the tabernacle, and God's glory is there. And so all through the whole of the Old Testament story, we keep seeing this idea of sacred space, how God is present in the world in connection with human beings. And Israel becomes the focal point of that as the Abrahamic people. God dwells in the midst of Israel for the sake of the world. Israel as son, servant, disciple, and witness is to be the light of the nations. So God's goal ultimately is all creation will become sacred space. But once that relationship between God and his creation is broken, now he starts the process of ending that brokenness, ending that estrangement, ending that exile by calling a people to himself. He calls Abraham and then Abraham's descendants to be that place and that point at which he is now related back to his creation. But at the center of that is always a sanctuary. God's present in the midst of his people in connection with the sanctuary. And ultimately, this is all moving now again towards how we think of incarnation. And we'll get to this. But John's gospel particularly is very concerned to understand this thing of incarnation and who Jesus is and what he's doing, God's purposes in and through him, in terms of this idea of temple or sanctuary. He's going to be the embodiment of the temple of God, the true sanctuary. So this is, again, another aspect or dimension of this understanding of how the scripture builds the case for incarnation. This is the way in which sacred space now actually becomes fully humanized. And that's ultimately where this is going. But
like I love that visual that you created about it, just taking on the idea of sacred space is not just this abstract concept, kid too, but it implies and it baked in with intimacy as well. Kid, building on what you just talked about, how did the prophets progressively concentrate and maybe even funnel is probably a better word, this restorative work almost like an hourglass into a single Davidic Israelite who embodies Israel, fulfills both sides of the covenant, and becomes the focal point of Yahweh's return to Zion?
well, this takes us back to the servant songs again. And I don't want to give the impression that all of what the Old Testament has to say about the coming Messiah and messianic work is just localized in those four servant songs. That's not the case. But they are a very kind of concentrated treatment of these ideas and themes. And so they're very important to our understanding of how God is building the case and revealing what it is that he's going to do, how he's going to do this restorative work. And as we've seen, the servant songs speak to the way in which God is going to cause the people of Abraham to fulfill their election and calling. Israel is the incorrigibly unfaithful son, servant, disciple, and witness, but God is going to cause Israel to be Israel by raising up from within Israel a servant who will be all of what Israel is not. He will be the faithful Israelite, the faithful servant, son, disciple, and witness for the sake of Israel's salvation, for the sake of then God's blessing going out to all the families of the earth as he pledged to Abraham. This is at the center of the servant songs. So they have a very kind of Israelite centric sort of quality to them. And as God is moving through the Old Testament history, he associates this with certain individuals. And you mentioned David. We spent a lot of time on David. And as God promises this restoration, he connects it with a particular son of David. David is the prototypical king who brings all the families of Israel together under Yahweh's rule. He's the son king par excellence. But God promises that another son to come from David will be the one in whom God will build David's house and throne and kingdom everlastingly. And in that way, God's own kingdom, his own design for his creation, will be realized. So this son of David, or this branch individual, becomes very important. And we talked about how the prophets build the case for, in that branch of David, God is going to merge together the priesthood and the kingship, and that he will build his everlasting, permanent, ultimate sanctuary dwelling place in and through that enthroned priest. So you have David language and the David promise bound up in that, and the merging of the kingship and the priesthood. But once again, Yahweh building a house that draws in all the people from all the families of the earth. So in various ways, different prophets with different focuses and emphases, the prophets are building a three-dimensional case and increasingly clear or elaborate portrait of how God is going to do what he's going to do. And so when we get into the gospel accounts, we're going to see that they want you to see that this man, this Israelite, Jesus of Nazareth, is that one that all the prophets have been promising. He is that son of David. He is that son of Abraham. He is the one in and through whom God is going to rebuild his house and establish his kingdom and the throne of David everlastingly. These are just some of the ways in which, again, the gospel writers want us to understand the meaning and significance of Jesus. But at the center of that is that Israel's own history as the Abrahamic people reaches its climax and its fulfillment in connection with that one. So as incarnation, this is Yahweh taking up, Abrahamic Israelite existence, taking up Israel's own life and lot for the sake of causing Israel to be Israel for the sake of the nations. That's a more biblical way of thinking about incarnation.
Right. As we close out this episode, how does the incarnation fulfill and transcend the sanctuary by making Jesus the ontological or being meeting place of God and humanity, revealing both God to man and true humanity to God for the sake of God's redemptive purposes for all creation? Once again, really zooming back out to that cosmic level of fulfillment. Speak to that a little bit as we wrap.
Well, one of the things that's important in that issue is this God to man, man to God idea. And the God set apart Abraham by covenant, and Abraham was in a very real way to be the revealer, the administrator of God's own mind and life and will in the world. Abraham, in a way, and the Abrahamic people, the people of Israel, were to be the disclosers of God. They were to be God unto the world, in a sense, and to be the mediators of bearing that relationship with the rest of the world back to God, that priest-king sonship idea. But in that sense, the covenant that God made with Abraham and then ratified with Israel, it disclosed and prescribed who God was in relation to Israel for the sake of the world, and who Israel was back to God for the sake of the world. That in that sense, we could say the covenant defined God unto mankind and mankind unto God, the divine human relationship. But that never worked out. Israel was always unfaithful to the covenant. And so the prophets, and certainly Isaiah does this, they speak of this coming servant as one whom God says, I make you to be the covenant of a people, the light of the nations. the restorer of the nations. I make you to be the covenant. Well, and the New Testament builds on this idea. How is Jesus the fulfillment of the covenant? He is he is both sides of that, right? He is the faithful God unto the world, and he is faithful mankind back unto God. This thing of incarnation is that he is the bringing together of God and man in himself, such that he is true God unto man and he is true man unto God. And that's at the heart of this idea of him being the covenant of the nations. But also the other thing that is a part of that question is the sanctuary idea. And the temple or the sanctuary was the place where heaven and earth came together. It was where God was present in the world, where he met with and interacted with his creation, specifically in connection with human beings. The temple or the sanctuaries were the place where God's human sons and daughters met with him for the sake of being witnesses of him and ambassadors of him, vice regents of him throughout the rest of the world. Well, Jesus is the embodiment of the sanctuary. He's the fulfillment of the sanctuary in that he is where God is present in relation to his creation. He is the bringing together of God and man, and therefore the bringing together of God and the rest of the creation. Jesus is the fulfillment of sacred space. In that sense, he's the fulfillment of Eden. He's the fulfillment of Canaan. He's the fulfillment of Jerusalem. He's the fulfillment of the temple. He is the true temple, but ultimately that he builds on himself the complete consummated temple, which consists of a new human race that are sharers in him, such that now the whole creation itself, with man restored, the whole creation can become sacred space. This is the way the book of Revelation ends. So we've gone full circle. We started by saying, what is God's intent in creating? Okay, well, his intent is to fill his creation with his presence and have it be sacred space with man at the center. Well, that's what we have being realized in the person of Jesus, and then ultimately through his death for the sake of the human race. And there's a lot in that, and we'll unpack that more in the coming weeks. But those two ideas of sanctuary and both sides of the covenant coming together, the divine side and the human side, covenant and sanctuary are key and crucially important aspects of our understanding biblically of this thing of incarnation. And hopefully our viewers at this point recognize we haven't talked about a hypostasis called divinity and a hypostasis called humanness, and how do they get stuck together. We haven't talked about that because the Bible doesn't treat the incarnation in that way. So what we're trying to do is say, how should we biblically understand this thing of God becoming flesh?
We sincerely hope this time you share with us has been profitable. We know we've dropped a lot on you. We're not naive to that fact too. So thank you for staying with us. Hopefully, as we continue this journey, don't forget to check out our website and subscribe to our YouTube podcast. And we look forward to you joining us for our next episode. Before we close out, I do want to make a quick plug. Kit and I often try to put out teasers just to kind of give you a little appetizer for the upcoming episode. We encourage you to look at those onto really digging into these longer format videos. So once again, thank you for being a part of the community. For Kit, I'm Faran, and we'll see you down the road.